Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us for our third session today on the narrow gauge study. We will be starting soon with a presentation here, but I wanted to let you all know how this afternoon session will go. We are in a webinar format, which means your screen and audio are disabled. We will open up for questions at the end of the presentation, and if you hover over the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A icon where you'll be submitting questions and comments through that. The chat is also disabled, so if you see that there, those messages will not come to us, only the Q&A function will. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our project team for some quick introductions, and then we will get started on the content. Please feel free anytime during the presentation to submit your questions. I will compile all of them and then read them out at the end of the session. Okay, Jen, take it from there, please.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, all. My name is Jennifer Lawson. I am the Water Quality Manager in the Systems Planning Unit for the City of Ann Arbor, the project manager for the Narrow Gauge Creek drainage evaluation that was recently completed. I have with me city staff member Mike and Cotton, our stormwater and regulatory coordinator for compliance. I also have two members of our engineering consulting team from Hubbell and Clark. That is John Ballant and Andy Grote. And thanks to them for joining us as well. They were the ones that were hoofing it out there and doing field investigation and all of the technical analysis, which is what we're going to walk through today. So I am going to switch over to my presentation and share screen real quick. Give me a minute. It always hesitates a little bit. Okay, can you see my presentation? Fantastic, thanks, Michelle. So just some background for those of you who may not be familiar with what this project endeavored to do. Sort of why are we here? Over the past decade and a half, city staff had been receiving complaints regarding flooding or standing water in the backyards at some addresses on Green Road. And after investigation, it was determined that this area is actually the stormwater detention pond for the neighborhood. It was a designed and specifically built stormwater management area to capture rainfall when it rained. So it didn't flood out significant parts downstream. That is a requirement, or I should say was, and still is a requirement of any development that happens in the city of Ann Arbor. So as we were working with property owners in the area regarding that stormwater detention pond, there were also some questions and concerns regarding potential sediment coming from upstream properties from that detention pond, specifically from the two city-owned parcels that are at the corner of Narrow Gauge Way and Green Road, as well as Narrow Gauge Nature Area, which continues all the way upstream to almost Fox Hunt. So that sort of opened up this question of, are there any best management strategies that the city and the neighbors can work on collaboratively to address sedimentation from upstream, as well as focusing on capitalizing or improving performance for that downstream stormwater detention basin? So the city hired a engineering consultant to complete a drainage analysis and field investigation of the entire upstream area. So what I'll be walking through for the next probably 10 or so minutes is the slides, the actual technical review and documentation from that field investigation. I'll talk through a few technical things, but then we're also going to talk about potential recommendations and next steps that either the city would be responsible for or private property owners as well as the homeowners association. So just for some context, the Narrow Gauge Creek is this area that sort of starts just east of Sky Knob, and it upstream flows all the way through the nature area, through these parcels between Barclay and Fox Hunt, almost up to Fox Hunt Drive. It does collect a larger area of drainage, but for purposes of this study, we were focused on the detention pond here, just east of Sky Knob. So that's between Sky Knob and Green, in the two parcels here. as well as anything upstream that would be sort of flowing through this detention basin. So I'm going to walk through essentially, if you can imagine yourself starting at the detention pond and walking entirely upstream. This is what field investigators found on site and sort of, again, a little bit of the recommendations that may come. So the outlet pipe specifically at the very bottom or downstream end of this entire drainage channel is a 36-inch pipe that is in fair condition. There's no proposed repairs. There is an animal guard on it that does catch debris. That's intentional. The homeowners association is responsible for maintaining that outlet guard, making sure that there's no debris hanging on it, mud. It is also for purposes of any critters from getting into the pipe because we don't want to have raccoons making their nests down in the pipe, which does happen on occasion. So starting at that downstream end, there are no recommendations. That outlet is in good condition. The pond itself is what's called a flow-through or an inline pond. Just for reference, on this middle photo here, this detention area is sort of shared between these two residential parcels in their backyard. So this picture is looking to the inlet, so sort of looking towards Green Road, and you can see that flow through channel that flows in that area. The way that this detention pond works is when there are larger events, the creek that sort of has flow through it most of the time, I'm not going to say all the time, but most of the time, in a larger rain event, that creek would overflow and that large flat area would store water. This is what's called a detention pond because it is dry. And then when it rains, it does hold water and then it eventually lets it go afterwards. A retention pond is a pond that holds water all the time and then can capture additional water after it starts raining. So just sort of a little bit of a technical term there. This pond here in the narrow gauge area, specifically in the Forest neighborhood, is a detention pond. One of the recommendations looking at this would be potential creek stabilization. This creek channel itself was partially eroded, not too severe, but armoring it with stone may assist with any potential sediment issues that could happen in the future. And then there are two inlets that come into this detention basin. The first that I'm going to talk about is a smaller inlet coming from sort of the southern part of Green Road. You can see this little icon coming in here. And again, this is capturing, or I'm sorry, it's preventing debris. It's also preventing any animals coming in. The pipe and the gates are in fair condition. And there are no recommendations for this smaller inlet pipe. The larger inlet pipe, however, is immediately underneath Green Road. This is a private culvert. Green Road at this point is a private road. So the city is not responsible for maintenance of the road, nor any appurtenance or pipe underneath it. So the homeowners association is responsible for maintenance of this. It is recommended, especially based on what our field engineers saw out in the field. There were some rust spots, there's some debris building up. It would be recommended to at least get that inspected. And if there were any inspection results that recommended rehab or replacement, that would be a recommended measure. And it's kind of an important one because if that culvert fails, Green Road will fail. And we don't think we want that necessarily to happen. Continuing upstream, so now we're on the east side of Green Road, this square down here for reference, are the two city-owned parcels that corner on Green Road and Narrow Gauge Way. There is, so the creek, if you will, flows through these parcels. It does touch on some private parcels, but the city parcels do have a significant amount of sediment that has deposited, because in large rain events, that pipe acts as a restriction to go underneath Green Road. So the sediment is falling out on the city properties. And then we also have some invasive species that should be addressed. You probably have seen the Phragmites and cattails out there. This is one of the recommendations that the city is looking at, is potentially removing some of that sediment and then working with our natural areas preservation group to remove the invasive species. Now, as we continue to move upstream, what you're going to see is a lot of the same pictures in varying degrees of severity, either log jams, woody debris management, or erosion. One thing to note sort of here on out, because the narrow gauge nature area is is a relatively pristine nature area, the city does not recommend bringing in any heavy equipment for any of this work. Any of the recommendations from here upstream, we would recommend are done through working with our natural areas preservation group, working with volunteers. It could be an Eagle Scout project, but it would all be hand work with small tools. We're not going to bring a dozer back there and ruin those woods because it's way too much of a beloved area by probably residents as well as city staff alike. So the recommendations are going to be a little more on the small scale. So just as a note to make. So we do see a fair number of log jams in the creek as it flows through. And while a log jam by itself in a low flow situation isn't a large issue, when there's a lot of water falling or rain falling, that log jam is blocking the flow and essentially moving the flow path of the creek elsewhere. Because this area has very erosive soils and cobbly soils, it just continues to erode, and that sediment continues to go downstream. And that's what we're trying to prevent. So in many of these instances, the log jam would most likely just be removed from the flow path. We don't want to remove the woody debris because that's where we see the critter habitat. That's where we see our amphibious habitat. And we want to make sure that we are maintaining that high level of environmental balance. So as we move upstream, there are some areas that have erosion. There are two examples of what we could do for, I'll say, the hand labor. And you do see a vehicle in the back. We're not going to bring a vehicle in. These are just as easily carried by two strong individuals. But this top picture, the orange snake-looking things, are coir fabric, and that's coconut fabric or coconut material that's put into a log, and it's laid on a slope and then planted with natural native plants. And so those roots will hold the structure of the soil. The picture on the bottom left is wattles or wood wattles. We would recommend like a dogwood, which has lenticels along its bark. And when you wrap those into essentially long cigars, tie them together and get their feet wet, all of those little lenticels will grow roots. And so in essence, we'll grow this wonderful wall of dogwood, and those roots are going to be really happy in holding the soil back. So we're using Mother Nature's mechanisms for soil erosion control. You'll also hear me call it soft armoring or low impact stream bank stabilization. Continuing upstream, we have fallen trees. In some instances, we would just remove some of the dead wood, move it out of the flow path. But again, we're not looking to remove a lot of the woody debris from this area. I mentioned cobbly soils. We do have several instances in this creek where there are very, very large rocks that have eroded out of the banks and have fallen into the flow path. Our recommendation is to leave these rocks as they oxygenate the water and they provide habitat for the benthic macroinvertebrate, or the bugs, if you will, that live in the water. These cobbles are left over from when the glacials moved over this area and deposited all of their glacial till. And Miller's Creek is fortunate enough in town to be one of the areas where we know we have a very high level of this glacial till with these large cobblestones and really sandy soils. The bad part about that, though, is that it's very erosive soils, and those soils have a tendency to move quickly downstream if we don't have methods of controlling them. Continuing upstream, there's a little bit more significant erosion. We would continue looking at some of those soft armor techniques, using low impact methods. Again, a lot of manual labor. Continuing with some more log jams. Some of these are obstructing the stream path or the flow route, and so we would look to move some of those at least out of the flow path, maybe possibly up onto the banks. So we're not getting the erosive nature of the creek essentially trying to move. Continuing with additional erosion, more log jams. As we move up in the creek, the banks get a little more severe. And so we see, you know, sort of it looks worse because there's a lot more debris that's evident. Again, larger log jams, we would remove these from the flow path, but we would still leave that woody debris behind as habitat. This is a larger area of erosion where those same wattles would be utilized. One method we would look at, though, is what's called a cross vein. And I mentioned the cobbles and the rocks that are in the creek that are sort of helping flow or helping direct the flow. A cross vein is essentially that. It's a pile of rocks to direct the flow path away from the bank, because we know that this is a pretty much, it's a more significant area of erosion. Continuing upstream with some additional log jams. Same type of treatment, we would look at removing woody debris in many of these instances. Same thing with many of these erosive areas. Same thing with these log jams. A lot of it is woody debris management as we move upstream through the natural area. So additional bank erosion. And then this is where we actually start getting into a little more human impact, that is pretty direct. There are some property owners that have fences or structures or I'll just call it waste piles, that they have in the stream channel or near the stream channel. And it would be recommended that we work with those property owners as riparian owners, but they sort of have a special responsibility to manage the creek channel as it flows through the forest. Same thing here, additional log jams, multiple fallen trees. We would definitely remove the trees from the flow path, but we would not remove that woody debris. The farther upstream we move, you can see the proximity of the houses to a lot of, or to the creek channel itself. One thing we were finding that certainly falls in line with the woody debris idea, but we were finding dead Christmas trees, and we were finding bags of leaves, and we were finding bags of lawn clippings. That kind of thing is well, for one, it's actually not allowable in the city, and it does go against ordinance. But that's something that we would certainly work with those riparian property owners to make sure that they're aware that this is not a dumping ground, and that the debris does need to be, their debris needs to be disposed of properly. Continuing upstream, log jam. And then sort of the summary slide, which is where we want to get into some of the details and have some discussion. There's two components of recommendations for this entire creek shed area. The city certainly has some responsibilities. We're going to evaluate the removal of the sediment on those two parcels, specifically at Narrow Gauge Way and Green. We are going to evaluate, first of all, how much sediment is there, and what impact sediment removal may have and how we can get in there. They are relatively accessible, but that would have to be done with equipment and machinery. That would not be done by hand. And then the second two bullets are working with our Natural Areas Preservation Group for woody debris management, as well as that low impact stream bank stabilization using those multiple techniques that I mentioned. And then on the flip side, there's some private responsibility. Certainly making sure that the homeowners association understands the importance of inspecting that private culvert that's underneath Green Road. Not saying that it's going to fail at any time, but it would be prudent to inspect it, or to at least get it on a regular inspection schedule, so you know that any preventative maintenance that needs to be done can be done to maintain the integrity of that culvert. And then maintaining the detention basin itself, making sure that that downstream debris guard is cleared, and recognizing that that detention basin does have a function of holding back water in large rain events. And then that third bullet, which I mentioned specifically on some of those more upstream properties, just recognizing that they do have that special job of maintaining the creek and sort of respecting the creek as it flows behind their properties. So, Michelle, I have put a lot of technical information and a lot of pictures in front of everybody. I do want to turn it over if there's any questions or if there's any follow-up information. One thing I do want to note, Mike and Cotton, who is on the call with us, she is our city's resident resource for all things private stormwater in the city. So the city, while we cannot expend public taxpayers' dollars on maintaining private infrastructure, we do want to act as a resource, and we at least want to point you in the right direction. Make sure that if you're not sure how to hire an engineer, how to work with an engineer, we'll certainly help you with that. We can't necessarily recommend who to work with, but we can give you a list of people that we could recommend for evaluating the culvert as well as evaluating the detention basin if there's any improvements that would need to be done. Okay. Thanks, Michelle.